Um, it's going to shape people's lives in ways that we will only really understand in the future. What I've been studying now.
Or like the paper, yeah, what you were talking
Okay,
about before, yeah.
So I have this project with Melissa Thomason on the effects of uh, the 1916 polio pandemic on educational attainment. So in this period of time, the early 20th century, um, there was this like massive surge in polio cases in the starting the summer of 1916, and it spread out from New York City across most of the United States. And at the start of the school year, this pandemic was raging, and a lot of local municipalities, health uh, school school boards and boards of health decided that they were going to postpone the start of the school year by a number of weeks. And and I found this kind of interesting. I started looking at this during my master's thesis almost 10 years ago, um, where and I was interested in how this disruption might have affected the educational attainment of students, because it's plausible that there are people that were working over the summer that would have been eligible to drop out, that were planning on going back into school and to complete their high school degree, uh, but decided to drop out after this disruption occurred. And then there's also these effects on younger cohorts, that at around age 9 to 10 there's this transition for kids to go from learning to read to reading to learn. And if you disrupt that transition, and that might impair their acquisition of human capital, especially for the more marginal students, because you might have to go through the material more quickly and thus they fall behind. There's a literature that suggests that occurs. Parents may have decided to redshirt their children, so children generally entered school around age 6. But if you defer that because you're afraid of the pandemic, because children ages 4 to 6 were most susceptible to the paralysis of the disease, then those kids reach these kind of legal thresholds at a lower level of educational attainment for dropping out. What Melissa and I had found was that basically young children were adversely affected by these school closures, and children that had workplace alternatives were directly affected by these school closures. And if we're trying to draw parallels today, a lot of what we do in education in the United States hasn't really evolved that much, actually, in a lot of ways, especially like this whole idea that you are teaching children how to read and the skills necessary to acquire future knowledge. And thus, if you disrupt that kind of learning, you have to do some catch up. And if you don't invest in catch up, or if catch up is not available to everyone, then you're going to have a large portion of the population that is going to not learn the necessary skills to continue learning effectively, and they're going to get further and further behind. And so you might get them in remedial education and things like that, but that might not get them catch back up, because it's kind of like this acceleration and so you learn knowledge, and that allows you to acquire more knowledge more effectively, more quickly, and then use it more effectively, more quickly. But if someone's didn't learn the necessary skills to do that, and everybody's moving ahead, they fall further behind. And that's something that we have to be very aware of, especially in developing countries. The United States was a developing country 100 years ago, and there's a lot of countries going through the same processes demographically, economically, that the United States kind of went through. And so those populations might experience similar effects. that that the United States experienced in 1916. We also have to think about, older cohorts that have workplace alternatives that might choose to, drop out of their education, and they might not get back in. So, and that's a thing where, and that can affect your kind of lifelong trajectories. There's a huge economics literature in labor economics that shows that, small changes in like initial endowments or human capital or investments can have lifelong effects on trajectories. I think about my generation and myself. I got exposed to a huge labor market shock when I came out of college. Policymakers need to be cognizant about the potential long-run effects of, socioeconomic disruptions. In my paper, I'm looking at a pandemic that led to school closures. I graduated during the Great Recession, or the aftermath of the Great Recession, to be correct. And these kind of disruptions, while they're transitory, can affect lifelong trajectories in educational attainment or income earnings. And those things can affect, and having like reduced educational attainment or reduced income earnings across the entire lifespan can really impact welfare, and not just of particular individuals, but across entire cohorts. And policymakers need to be cognizant of this, and consider potentially like compensatory actions, because we can make small investments now to rectify damage, keep people enrolled in college or in jobs, and minimize these like long run costs. Because if you just let entire cohorts of the population get really disrupted, the scarring effects of those can persist for a long period of time. And those not only affect individual welfare and well-being, but they also affect, our tax base in the future and our ability to, pay pensioners and things like that. And if we're worried, and if, one of the responsibilities of, politicians that are elected or elected leaders is to ensure the general welfare, I think it's important that we actually understand the whole costs of, these social disruptions. We're going to be living with the consequences of the COVID-19 pandemic for decades. These that we will only really understand in the future. And people have in the past like borne the scars of, the 1918 influenza, polio pandemics, the Great Depression and such. And we see these things crop up periodically, and they have persistent effects across our entire society. And so we can intervene to help at least mitigate some of these long run effects, and maybe even rectify them.